How would you feel about using your phone to verify your identity? It's seen as the breakthrough method of identity verification. Instead of presenting a physical ID like a driver's license or passport, all you would need is your phone.
You are essentially just making it easier for everyday people to go about their daily lives.
It's sold as more convenient, efficient, and it's already being implemented in several countries. And it's a move our Minister for Digitising Government says could save billions of taxpayer dollars. So what's the catch?
What worries me at the moment is the pace at which we're doing some things.
The truth around who's going to governance this, those are really important scrutiny questions that need to be asked. And if there was a line that we had to cross where we were just taking it on trust with politicians, I would be worried that someone's going to switch off my access to the NHS because I've said something on GMB that's upset some politician somewhere.
You would never do that.
There is a freedom question here.
There are enough examples that things can go wrong that we shouldn't, push people to complete compliance.
Hi, I'm Davina Zimmer, and today on The Detail, I'm heading to downtown Auckland to meet a privacy and cyber law expert to help me unpack some of the issues skeptics have raised about digital IDs. But before that, let's get some context on what digital IDs are and look at the developments both here and internationally.
I'm Paul Spain. I'm Chief Executive and Futurist at Gorilla Technology. My take on the role of a futurist is that it's actually a role that we all should carry, so that we all should be looking forward, looking at the future, seeing how we can impact and change the future through good actions and activities, whether that's what we do in our everyday lives, personally with our families, or what we do within a business and a work context.
One of the things in our not-so-distant future, digital IDs. So what exactly are they?
A digital ID is really an extension of technology and data that we've had in varying forms for a long time, and identification systems, which of course we've had for a long, long time. And so today those systems are somewhat variable in terms of how effective they are. You can prove yourself with a birth certificate in some scenarios, or a photo ID such as a driver's license or a passport. But there's some variability as to how good those things are. So I think the promise of digital ID is to make identifying ourselves and identifying certain information smoother and simpler. Let's say it's a scenario where you want to buy something that is age restricted. In a normal scenario today, where looking at you, maybe the seller isn't too sure, maybe it's at the supermarket and you're buying a bottle of wine and they're not quite sure whether you're the right age or not, then you need to find your photo ID. It's got a bunch of details on there, your birth date, and you share all of that information. In a digital ID world, that might be done through your phone, and what it might do is just verify that you're of sufficient age without sharing the broader information around your birth date and other bits and pieces of information.
It's kind of like using Apple Pay instead of a physical card.
If you think of making a payment when you go into a store with a sort of tap and pay type of scenario, the store just gets paid. The store does not get to record your credit card number and all of the details. They just get a verification back from the payment institution that you've paid and, a few little bits and pieces of information, but they don't get enough to then be able to fake those transactions. Whereas if you take your credit card, as I was asked to do in New Orleans in the last few days, they wanted to take my credit card and wander off around the restaurant with it before returning it to me. And at that time, they could have, scribbled down the details and gone online and made transactions. So there's a much more secure way of doing things when we do it using a secure digital mechanism.
Digital IDs aren't some new radical idea, and information about us has been stored with different businesses and entities we interact with for a long time. Think your tax details or the Electoral Commission holding your phone number and where you live. But Paul says digital IDs are next level and will make processes quicker.
For example, when I flew out of Houston a couple of nights ago, I did not need to open up my passport and present that at the gate. Instead, they had previously taken a photo of me. They verified me against the photo in their system. And so it became very seamless for me just to walk onto the aeroplane. And this is the sort of seamlessness that digital ID is, part of.
I mean, it feels a bit invasive, doesn't it? I mean, you're just talking about going to the US and they're scanning your face, they're taking your fingerprints, and now they have all this data on you that they're just storing, and you kind of wonder, they can do God knows what with it. I mean, you can surely understand people's concerns about that.
Yes, and look, we recently saw what happened in Myanmar, where government there had taken images and had those stored of individuals, and then when military took over, then they used that information to be able to, track the people they considered dissidents.
And this highlights the risks critics of digital IDs are talking about, that this kind of technology in the wrong hands can result in individuals losing freedom of speech and privacy, which is why the freedom of choice to opt in or out of using it is vital.
We need to think about, in the sort of short to mid-term, those who might not easily be able to adopt the technology. And, I think it's appropriate to also consider those who are uncomfortable with the technology. And so we don't just say, look, this is how it is, you must be onboarded and using this technology, that we create those edges so people don't feel like government is infringing on their privacy, on their own human rights. And when we look at, some of the cases like Myanmar and China, even the UK, where things have gone wrong, Australia.
At least 9,000 New South Wales court documents have been leaked after the state's online registry website was hit with a major data breach.
We've seen it in New Zealand with Waikato District Health Board.
Clinical services at Waikato, Thames, Tokoroa, Tikoti and Taumaranui hospitals are seriously affected by a cybersecurity incident with all phones and computers down.
There are enough examples that things can go wrong that we shouldn't, push people to complete compliance with this type of technology. And I know that has some downsides. We don't get the full benefits unless we enact this and enforce it on everyone. But I think we still get a significant upside through giving people that optionality.
They're constantly monitored by facial recognition cameras that are able to instantly put a face to a name. Now the Chinese are also ranked, given a mark out of a possible 950 points. A score in the 700s is considered good. Around the 500 mark is not. For now, the number is a sort of bank credit rating, keeping track of everyone's spending habits.
A social scoring system, what it does is it gives you credit for the good things that you do that the technology is able to detect. So you paid your tax on time, you're doing the things that can be measured, you put your rubbish out in an appropriate way, you don't put too much rubbish out and overfill your bin. The camera might, catch you putting too much rubbish out. Or maybe you get involved in a protest that the government doesn't like, so that might be on the flip side where you'll lose points. And then, based on what the computers decide effectively, that might help you. So it might help you get maybe to the top of the list for healthcare a little bit quicker. But it also might mean that your kids can't go to the school that you would like them to go to, or now you can't travel on the high-speed train in China, or you can't go on an aeroplane because, sorry, that's only for, those who are really of the best behaviour. So it's a way of being able to control a populace. And you can understand in a authoritarian regime that is run in China by the Chinese Communist Party, you're trying to do something and to manage a really big population in a particular way. And this type of technology enables that.
The idea of being tracked and losing access to certain rights like public transport and healthcare sounds scary, but that is what some fear digital IDs will become. Paul says we need to be mindful about what we're getting into.
Around the complexities of governments that will swing from left to right, we've got minor parties that can then maybe require certain things in order to form a government. And so sometimes you might get things that is pretty distasteful to people if we were to look out over the longer term, because you've got to recognise that a decision to implement this type of technology is something that has ramifications, most likely for all future generations. And it's not easy to get things right from the get-go with technology. We look at social media. It's been around for 20 years, but there's still a lot of harm that social media causes, and we haven't quite worked out as a society, how do we get that right? How do we balance the good of this technology that I find really helpful, but then on the flip side, we're hearing of the harm and all the other, bad sides. So, these same things apply to all technologies. The technology in and of itself isn't good or bad, but it's how we take advantage of it and how we adjust it over time.
New Zealand doesn't have digital IDs yet, but that is the end goal. It kicked off early last year with the launch of the new NZTA app, and the Minister for Digitising Government, Judith Collins, is hoping digital driver's licences will be available by the end of this year. Over time, it will expand to an app that can hold all of an individual's information, from car registration to tax details and everything in between. Winston Peters called the move to digitise licences a digital overreach, but Joe Edwards, who's a lawyer specialising in privacy and cyber law, doesn't think it is.
If it's voluntary, I don't think it is an overreach. I think if it was used compulsorily by the government, so you didn't have a choice, then that raises all sorts of factors about people who don't like using smartphones for the totally justified reasons. There will be a section of the population who won't be comfortable with this type of technology and this being forced upon them, and I think that is an overreach, and I can see where Mr. Peters is coming from in that regard. But once it's voluntary, I think concerns sort of drop away. We all have a choice. Personally, I would use it. I find these things very efficient. That's the way the world's going, and trying to embrace technology, but you shouldn't have to if you're not comfortable. If you look at some of the media and some of the publications, the talk is, well, what happens if I don't have a smartphone? And that's a fair point. What happens if I don't support or don't trust the people who make the smartphones? That's another fair point. So you shouldn't be forced to. But I think as long as you've got freedom and you have visibility over essentially what is being collected and how it's being used and by whom, then I think most people will be comfortable with that.
And so when it comes to digital IDs, are there any immediate red flags that stand out to you?
Not from a legal perspective in terms of immediate red flags. There are concerns that anyone needs to have. My initial reaction was, as soon as you put anything in the cloud or you store it electronically, you open yourself up to being hacked. And then once anything gets hacked, it's very hard to get it back, and it's out there on the dark web. And I imagine that's one of the concerns most people will have over these digital IDs. That's my initial reaction. And then there will also be just general privacy concerns. What's being collected, for what purposes, and more importantly, are people aware of what's being collected and have a choice as to whether they actually disclose that?
This government will make a new free-of-charge digital ID mandatory for the right to work. For too many years, it's been too easy for people to come here, slip into the shadow economy and remain here illegally.
In Britain, they're saying people can fake this national number that is used to kind of verify that you can work. But how easy would it be to fake this digital ID? Would that be a concern?
That would be one of my primary concerns, and that takes me back to what I said at the start when you were asking me your initial questions, which is, what's my red flag? My red flag is actually that cyber attack, because if you think about these professional cyber attackers, what they're doing at the moment, they are cyber attacking businesses to get your information for identity theft. So they're already doing this. If they had the ability to then get your digital ID and then pass themselves off as you, where you don't have to be there in person for that business to know if it's you because you're providing the digital ID, that to me is a real concern. That's where governments have to try and keep up with technology. And cyber attackers are very, very sophisticated people. They're very sharp operators. And I see that as being one of the primary risks. We've obviously got AI in which everyone's talking about. And that's also a concern, how you'd use AI to potentially manipulate the digital identities. That to me is probably the primary risk. It's all about transparency. You as the individual need to know what's being collected, who it's being collected by, why, and how it's being used and who it's being disclosed to. So for a digital identity, it obviously makes sense in terms of when you are trying to verify who you are. And, if I hand over a digital version of a driver's license to prove my identity, that's okay. But you need to know, is that being stored by the person who you're showing it to? How are they then going to use it? All those sorts of issues all need to be assessed in line of the Privacy Act. But it's all doable, and as long as businesses take the right approach, I have no concerns. I imagine what people out in the public would be worried about, though, is if the government are essentially compelling them to provide this information, how are they going to be using it now and, more importantly, in the future? Because governments change, things move on. And I obviously, as I said at the start, I always have those concerns about things being hacked.
Joe says New Zealanders have some good protections, though, in the form of a very good Privacy Commissioner and its office, as well as the Department of Internal Affairs. And he doesn't think we'd stand for any overreach from officialdom. But what about the people who just don't trust the government or their agencies?
What I would say is there are enough checks and balances in this country with the courts, the regulators, and just New Zealanders in general, that I think if the government went too far, there would be sufficient pushback. And ultimately, if you don't like it, there would be an election and there would be a change of government. And that happens regularly. And if people feel really strongly about these sorts of things, then this will become a political issue. And people will be able to vote with their feet, so to speak.
But how much of a trade-off is it when these developments chip away at our privacy? Joe points out that's already happening.
If you're driving down a street in Auckland, then the chances are there might well be CCTV who are capturing that footage. And the reason they are doing so is to detect offences and to prevent them. So there's a good reason for doing it. I suppose my point is, with the digital ID, as long as it's being done for the proper purposes, ultimately this is mainly going to benefit people because of the convenience, but there are also good purposes as well. Now, is it an erosion of rights of privacy? Well, I think everything is an erosion of privacy, because your starting point is, it's my information, nobody should have it, know anything about me. But then you wouldn't be able to operate in our society. So there has to be a little bit of erosion each time. And as long as, in my view, it's done for the right things and it's done in accordance with the law, then that's acceptable.
It's a really difficult topic, right? I mean, a lot of what we're talking about is hypothetical because it hasn't happened yet. But then at the same time, some of the hypothetical scenarios sound quite scary and extreme, and we don't necessarily want to get there. So how do we get the balance right of taking advantage of this technology, making sure it's used in a way that doesn't end up going down the wrong path?
Yeah, well, I suppose it begs the question, well, what's the wrong path? I think anyone who says you are eroding people's privacy, they might say that is the wrong path straight away. My sort of view is this information's already being collected, and as long as that's what's happening, it's just being collected in another format, and people still have a choice and they understand what they're doing. I struggle to see how we're going down the wrong path, to be perfectly honest. And even, for example, if you use your more extreme example, so I'm walking down the street and I get stopped by a police officer who wants to know who I am, and then I have to provide my digital ID to them in the same way I'd have to provide my driver's license. I really don't see that as a problem. It's just more efficient.
Mm-hmm. So what do you think, what are some measures that you would hope would be implemented to combat issues like that?
Yeah, well, the laws already exist. Businesses have to take certain security standards under the Privacy Act to protect personal information. And this is as sensitive as it gets. It's not even health information, it is who you are, what you look like, your name, your address, so that you can essentially be defrauded. So businesses have to do that. There's a really good framework in place about the people who offer digital ID services as well. So that should give a lot of your listeners comfort that the government actually manages that from a practical perspective. But in terms of mitigating risks, it's really only collecting what you genuinely need for the purpose. And if, for example, what is in that digital ID is a lot of information that really never needs to see the light of day and never needs to be disclosed to party X or party Y, then really it shouldn't be collected either by you or by them. So
if I were to go to IRD with my digital ID and say, hey, I want to do my tax return, they would take some of my details. You're saying the risk would be with how long IRD keeps my details in their system, not necessarily my digital ID.
That's right. I mean, if you think about it, really it should just be a case of they're verifying who you are. And that's all they need it for.
And then get rid of it.
Exactly. And so I suppose that goes to where you were heading with some of your other questions, which is there something we need to be concerned about? Well, if businesses are retaining it and they're building up a richer profile of you than they actually need, that's not what the digital ID is about. It's supposed to be proving your identification.
New Zealand's Privacy Commissioner, Michael Webster, agrees. In a written statement, he says it makes a big difference when and how often organisations are asking for an individual's identity and what they're going to use it for. He adds it also comes down to how much power people have over their information. If digital IDs are just a way of linking up systems that hold information and people have good visibility and real choices, including the choice not to use digital ID, that is good for privacy. If it's more centralised or less transparent, he says, that is where we know New Zealanders have real concerns. Paul Spain says there's a level of inevitability about this, but we need to educate ourselves about the worst case scenarios.
What worries me at the moment is the pace at which we're doing some things. You know, in the tech world, often, you know, we look at those that are innovating fast and, you know, the likes of Rocket Lab, and they're going, you know, so quickly and, you know, they're killing it on the global stage. And that's awesome for, you know, an aerospace company or a tech startup. But for a business, if they lose out on this revenue stream or that revenue stream, you know, okay, look at, you know, somebody loses their money if it doesn't play out so well, but that's about it. But where a government moves too fast and we lean into technology and we don't figure out those empathy elements and so on, then we end up with people on the sidelines that are, you know, that are hurt in one way or another. You know, we saw this in the United Kingdom where I saw some reports around their digitised universal credit platform, and there were statements that this unchecked use of technology and AI ended up leading to the exclusion of people with disabilities and other marginalised groups. So I think we've got to look at those examples where there have been stumbles and there have been issues, and we've got to figure out, you know, how do we make sure that we don't dehumanise our world, because unless we add in a human element, raw technology is dehumanising, right? There is no human element. So I guess what gets me excited is looking at, well, how can we add in the humanisation? How can we add in empathy when we move forward with technology so we get those great outcomes?
And that wraps up another week of The Detail, a newsroom production supported by RNZ and NZ On Air. This episode was engineered by William Saunders and produced by Alexia Russell. Thank you to Paul Spain and Joe Edwards for joining me, Davina Zimmer. Have a great weekend and we'll be back in your ears on Monday. Ka kite.